Our second speaker this afternoon is Professor Sylvie Delacroix, Professor in Law and Law and Ethics, rather, at the University of Birmingham. Sylvie works at the intersection between these two areas in the academy, and has also worked on public policy commissions and co-chairs the Data Trust Initiative. And she's going to talk to us today about learning through experimentation, augmented reality, and pre-reflective intelligence. Once again, Sylvie, about 35 minutes, then we have time for questions. I'll give you a bit of warning before the end, if that would be useful. Please take it away.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for inviting me. I should say that I'm not going to have a very sophisticated, well-cooked paper to present, unlike Eric's very impressive paper we just had. This is really an attempt to connect the dots between experiments that I did a long time ago involving virtual reality and questions that are at the forefront of my mind today when it comes to ethics and also potentially regulation. So first I should, because my slide is really an attempt to anchor the question I'm going to talk about to try and tie it to something you'll be more familiar with. But first I should say the context. The context is this. So for about 10 years, I have been working, and I'm still working on habits and pre-reflective intelligence. And one of my key research questions was to try and understand the role played by pre-reflective agency, and including habits, in the way we make morally loaded decisions. Okay, and what I found really interesting was that while there is literature on this from a philosophical perspective, and there are studies of expertise that also highlight the role played by, some people call it intuitive intelligence, some people call it pre-reflective. Here, I'm not going to go into a kind of battle of words, but what was really interesting to me was that for reasons that are actually quite intuitively easy to grasp, there were no empirical studies of the role played by basically habits in the way people make morally loaded decisions. And it's obvious why, right? It's very difficult to replicate in a reliable way habits in an experimental setting. You can't ask people to fake habits, and you can't, or you'd have to run an experiment over a very long period of time, potentially, with all sorts of uncertainties about when the habit is going to emerge, if it's going to emerge at all, et cetera, et cetera. So it's something inherently difficult to study empirically. But I was intrigued when I met colleagues in UCL who had published a paper, I think it was back in 2011. It was a small pilot study that looked to replicate the trolley scenario in virtual reality, so in fully immersive virtual reality in what was the cave at the time in UCL, I'll explain. And so they replicated the trolley scenario in a fairly schematic way. And one of the things they found was that people who had experienced the trolley scenario in virtual reality were more likely to answer the questionnaire-based trolley scenario in a utilitarian way than those who hadn't experienced. So there were two versions, right? Who hadn't experienced one version of trolley scenario in virtual reality. And to me, that raised significant questions, because then you think, okay, we know that one of the advantages of virtual reality, I'm going to transfer to AR soon, but one of the advantages of virtual reality is that it can trick the mind into mobilizing basically pretty primitive reactions. So even though we know it's not real when we enter, say, a virtual reality scenario, parts of our very primitive reactions like fear, sweat, heartbeat going up, etc., get mobilized in a way we can't control. And these very physiological indicators of basically emotional involvement are not as reliably live when you do, for instance, role play. Yeah, so it was interesting to me because it was then an indication that potentially you could replicate a morally loaded situation in this case, virtual reality, with the hope that you might be able to study more reliably those non-cognitive kind of drivers that underlie the way we actually live through moral situations, right? So that was the context, and I was, of course, teaching in a law school. I put together this new course in law and ethics, and I was keen to get my students to try this trolley scenario in virtual reality. And what I did then in this course was ask them first, as you do in sad philosophy classes, where you ask them, if you go through the variety of trolley scenarios, and you ask them how they would react in such and such version. And what was really interesting was then I asked them to record their answers, and then they went into the virtual reality scenario, which was a cave. I will explain what this cave is, but it's basically a box 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters with high quality projectors, which enables students to actually experience the virtual reality scenario together. There would be 2 students in the cave. It wasn't at the time, I mean, compared to what we can do now, it's incredibly low tech. The precision of the graphics wasn't amazing. But what was super interesting was that the students, first, a majority of students actually acted in a way that was contrary to what they said they would do on paper. And so after the immersion, we had debates with students to try and reflect on what happened and what contributed to this discrepancy between abstract ethical stance and actual behavior. And so that kind of grounded the course. And since then, I then thought, okay, it could be really interesting to look at GPs, because GPs in the UK, we know that they have the famous 10 minutes appointments, if that. And so it's a great context within which you can study a morally loaded decision in a very limited time frame, because otherwise it's too complicated to replicate. And so we ran 2 studies. One was a patient who demanded antibiotics when there were actually no indication that antibiotics should be prescribed. And then another one was a patient who showed up with his son, and we had different versions of the scenario to test. But basically, we wanted to see whether the GPs, who were real GPs, would pick up signs of child safeguarding concerns, right? So the dad would show, this was designed with people who were experts in child safeguarding, where the children would flinch, the child would flinch at certain movements. The dad would talk in a pretty aggressive and anyway, in your face kind of way to his son, etc., etc. And what was really, anyway, I won't delve into that too much, but this is for context. This is where I come from. So my interest in habits and pre-reflective agency has not died, but I have left virtual reality behind me for simple reason. It just took incredible amounts of time. And today, though, I mean, especially since Apple announced its new AR, I mean, mixed AR, VR, what we could do today is incredible, because one of the things that made these experiments really difficult was that we had to imagine every single question that a GP could ask of the avatars. So I don't know if you can imagine the difficulty here, but you have to anticipate, let's say I'm a GP and I ask, how are you feeling today? I have to have an answer for that in the avatar. So at the time, we didn't have large language models. We didn't have generative AI. And so we had to code everything by hand, so to speak, which took huge amounts of time. Whereas now, if you combine these large language models like GPT-4 with the kind of stuff that Apple has just revealed, I mean, goodness me, what we did in a year and a half could be done probably in a month, or I don't know, I haven't tried. But so actually, it's a very opportunistic time to reconsider some of the questions that kind of caught me at the time. So now I'm going to start the proper kind of philosophical discussion. This was just context. My slide starts with this question: what are we trying to safeguard when we worry about manipulation? And in a way, this ties in very nicely with Eric's talk, because, okay, one of the things I left, one of the concerns that really emerged as I worked on these virtual reality scenarios with GPs was the extent to which you could manipulate people in an incredibly powerful way by simply either repeatedly exposing a real participant to a particular type of virtual reality scenarios. You can, for instance, desensitize someone to certain encounters. You can also, well, as the trolley scenario experiment showed, you can actually change the likely ethical stances on paper, at least. I mean, even that the numbers weren't high enough to be statistically robust, and there are question marks about how long these effects last. I don't think they last that long, but still, it's the kind of technology that is, I mean, we can be manipulated in all sorts of ways, but if you use VR or augmented reality for manipulative ends, you're going to have a tool in your hands that's going to be, I mean, much more powerful than anything we have at our disposal today, including social media platforms. So what I want to elaborate on basically is, okay, let me see if I can actually move. Yeah. I'm going to go quite quickly through the philosophical discussion because I want to go to the specifics as soon as possible. So basically, when we ask what we worry about when we worry about manipulation, here I've listed three kind of, the two first answers are kind of probably known to you, and the third one is unlikely to be known to you. So the first type of answer is an answer that, say, Sunstein would probably formulate, where, I mean, Sunstein incredibly thinks that actually any form of non-deliberative influence is a form of manipulation. At least in some articles, that's what he defends. And I mean, that's an incredibly problematic position to take, because of course, we all know that non-reflective or non-cognitive influence can be a form of emotional intelligence and a way of coping with that. So to blanket any form of non-deliberative influence as a form of manipulation is to really be ignorant or blind to the extent to which actually we rely on non-cognitive influence for all sorts of things in our lives that we wouldn't call manipulation. And it would actually miss the very precious elements underlying this non-cognitive influence if we call it manipulation. So, so the first answer is kind of easily dismissed. The second answer basically is a more sophisticated answer that tries to say, okay, and here the most sophisticated account I've seen is from Chrisman, who tries to define a test for manipulation, which he calls the retrospective endorsement test, right? And in this retrospective endorsement test is designed to take into account both the cognitive and to some extent the emotional elements that we see as validly influencing us. So here the question is, for instance, if I say I've been manipulated, I'll give you an example, it'll be easier. So let's say that I have been sold, a company wanted to sell me some burglar alarm. And as a result, my social media feed showed me or prioritized any news of burglary around me, recommended friends who are very security conscious, etc., etc. And as a result of this intervention, I've not only bought a burglar alarm, I have actually become a very conscious, a security conscious person. I've joined, say, Neighborhood Watch, etc., etc. Now, the question that Crispin would ask is, would you endorse the self that you have become? Would you, are you happy effectively with the self you have become, knowing that it's the product of a manipulative influence? And if I say yes, if I say, look, I'm proud of who I've become, I'm proud of being this security conscious mom, let's say, then who is to say that this instance of manipulation is morally condemnable, right? So here the question that we face is, even with the most sophisticated accounts of manipulation, we end up with basically exoneration conclusions for cases of influence that we feel are nevertheless morally problematic, but where, let's say, I am proud of this security conscious self I have become, has nothing wrong happened here, right? And this is a case of social media influence. And to pick up what might have gone wrong in this particular example, we need more than just the retrospective endorsement test. So the retrospective endorsement test, as defined by Chrisman, is the minimal competence plus authenticity. And Chrisman is to some extent aware of the problems when he says, well, the hypothetical reflection must be such that it is not the product of social and psychological conditions that prevent adequate appraisal of oneself. Okay, now I find this very interesting to think about. I will switch to AR and VR in a minute, but I just want to go one step further. So how can we do better than the reflective endorsement test, or what are we missing rather in this particular account of manipulation? And I argue that what we're missing is a concern for what I call, or what Rehol Yegi calls, inner mobility. I find that particular phrase really evocative. So she came up with this phrase, inner mobility. And she argues that when you lose inner mobility, you effectively become alienated, right? And alienation is effectively defined as cases where you lose the means to, again, always become different, of being capable of always becoming different from who you are currently. So this really ties in with what Eric was talking actually about before. So if inner mobility is something we should be concerned about, and in the case of social media, to me, this is a salient question actually, but I'm not here to talk about social media. I'm here to talk about augmented reality and virtual reality. And this is where it ties in. It's very experimental, like in the sense that I haven't formulated these thoughts in a very sophisticated way, but I'm here to test the waters with you guys. So one thing that I'm intrigued by is this. On one hand, if you were to worry about the potentially negative implications of using what now is likely to be augmented reality. I mean, the advantages of augmented reality when it comes to as a tool for training or behavioral intervention are huge compared to virtual reality. So, but what I worry about is effectively when these tools are used for either training or for, like, the rehabilitation program I was mentioning in my question to Eric before, where the state decides that they need to make it less likely that you offend again, right? And so they're gonna, in this case, leverage whether it's virtual or augmented reality as a tool to try and change your behavior in the future. So it's, you could call it a form of nudge, but I think it's a lot more than a nudge. So what I would like to speak about, or what I want to think through here, are these two questions. On one hand, it is very clear to me that there are significant more concerns about the dangers inherent in these interventions, which are not captured by a consequentialist kind of framework. It's not about whether these experiments might go wrong. I'm sure they could go wrong. It's not about how long these effects could last. Again, there's mixed evidence about that. What I really worry about is what some people would frame in terms of dignity, but I don't think the concept of dignity here does specific enough work. And that's why I want to unpack this notion that perhaps what could be lost if we are not opening our eyes to this importance of inner mobility is precisely a sense of agency as a self-transformation power that could be compromised in the long term by tools such as augmented and virtual reality. So that would be the danger side. Now, on the positive side, what I find fascinating is that actually one of the things I'm working on a lot at the moment is basically the extent to which we are being encouraged by all sorts of tools around us, whether it's social media or the way data governance is framed, to become increasingly passive in the face of choices that are actually not just consequentially significant, they're also morally, from a more deployment of self perspective, significant. And that is, so the extent to which we are basically encouraged to basically click away those windows that ask us if we consent to our data being used for this purpose or that purpose, more and more we are navigating a reality that is structured by data reliant tools that are designed to basically leverage our natural laziness, right? And of course, the reality of these data governance issues is incredibly complex. And so because it's left to the individual to deal with this on a daily basis, we all basically retreat to a bubble of passivity. And so what I'm exploring for the moment in collaboration with various people is, can we reverse this habit of passivity, and can we design basically augmentation tools, like it could be a recommended tool for books or all sorts of augmentation tools, like GPUs, etc. Can we design these tools in a way that lends itself to learning through experimentation? So instead of incentivizing a passive stance, it would incentivize long-term contestability. It would incentivize experimenting with the tool so that you'd have an ability to actually play with different components of what you see, whether it's online or in this case, in the augmented reality context. And I find this particular theme is very rarely talked about as a kind of, call it a policy concern, potentially, as a way of saying, what should we be asking for when we are basically designing tools that will be used in morally loaded contexts, especially public-facing morally loaded contexts, just such as education, justice, and healthcare. These are the three big examples, right? And actually, I think it's highly likely that we're going to use augmented reality in the not too distant future in the sphere of healthcare and education, perhaps less so in justice, but again, I'm sure this will happen at some point. And so the questions that come to mind and that are not really talked about, that's why I want to air this now, is, you know, a lot of people in the discussion about how we should design these tools, a lot of people insist on transparency, on explainability, or what some people call interpretability. A few are actually unpacking this notion of interpretability in a way that emphasizes the importance of the possibility of co-construction and hence of learning through experimentation. And so this, I think, is actually super important. And this is where, okay, here are pictures of the experiments I mentioned in my kind of context bit before I started. So this was a paper we published in 2016. So it does feel ancient actually now. And you can see the avatars are really not high resolution at all. This was done on a shoestring. And you can see here the GP, there's a real GP wearing an Oculus Rift and in a real GP room. Now, it would have been so much easier to use augmented reality lenses. We did try HoloLens, they just weren't working at the time. Because then you don't have to recreate the whole GP room. Yeah, so you can just have avatars, like in this case, avatar patients sitting in a real consultation room and use these avatars for training, in this case, GPs. And so the first study we published was basically showing, we wanted to see whether the degree of experience of a GP would have an effect on the ability to withstand abusive demand for antibiotics. And it was very interesting to see what factors were actually influencing this ability. And mostly it was, of course, surprise, surprise, psychological factors rather than experience. Another study, that's okay. Then we ran, of course, an evaluation. Partly the most interesting bit was what the GPs told us afterwards about this experiment. And then, yeah, the idea was to create something in the context of justice, but we ran out of time. I mean, I ran out of time, actually, I had to move on. But yeah, I think you can see now they all have these virtual reality headsets. Forget about this. This is not the future. Yeah, I think right now, especially since I've seen the Apple advert, I'm a bit of an Apple junkie, I confess, but still, this is a game-changing moment to have lenses that allow you to see real people around you in the real context, and to switch from one to the other, and to just have, in this case, like virtual patients sitting in front of you for training purposes. It's incredibly powerful. But so then what are we about? Effectively, these are two questions. First question is potential for abuse and potential for what you could call mind formatting in a way that's extremely dangerous, or behavior formatting. So that's one. And then the other one is positively, how can we formulate in a constructive way a concern that I call a concern for what I call inner mobility, or what Rehol Yegi calls inner mobility, and that translates into a demand for co-constructibility, effectively, or a demand for long-term incentives to get users of various tools, whether it's augmented reality or not, to have the power to shape these tools in the longer term. I think this is super important because effectively we keep learning morally loaded intuitions, or we keep refining these intuitions through a process of experimentation with our environment. If you take that out of the equation, my worry is that this non-reflective process that underlies the formation of relevant intuitions becomes frozen, and hence we lose what is, in my view, a very precious resource quite often. And that precious resource are these intelligent intuitions that we develop on the basis of experience and experimentation. And so my question to you is, if it sounds important to you, should this be something that can be translated in terms of policy recommendations or design constraints? That's it. I'm going to stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sylvie. If you could stop sharing your screen, I think it will let us see your.
That would be better. Stop sharing. There we are.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Well, as before, we have some time for questions. Please communicate your desire to ask a question to me in the usual way. Max, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks very much, Ben. Thank you, Sylvie, for the tremendous presentation. I wanted to ask you about the retrospective endorsement. So I think that you're right. In some cases, it seems less problematic if a person is able to endorse a certain first order preference on a higher level and say, this is really me, and that makes me authentic. But in other cases, you might think it makes it even worse because the manipulation goes even deeper. And then you had this one slide about Christman's position that the hypothetical reflection needs to satisfy certain requirements. And so I just wanted to ask you whether you endorse that position or whether you have a different view on how you deal with cases where the endorsement on the second order level makes the cases more problematic rather than less problematic.
Yeah, it's a great question. Basically, what so I don't effectively buy this reflective endorsement test as a foolproof test to capture morally problematic cases of influence, right? So if the question at stake is, we need a tool to identify whether a seemingly problematic case of influence is indeed morally condemnable or legally condemnable, then the reflective endorsement test, even as formulated by Christman, and I just, I haven't read the whole literature, but at least from what I've read, Christman's account seemed quite sophisticated and takes into account valid objections that could be leveraged against other forms of reflective endorsements. But even his account, in my view, fails to give us tools to capture something that has gone wrong, but which would otherwise lead to an exoneration conclusion on the basis of only his reflective endorsement test. Yeah. So basically, I'm saying his reflective endorsement test is it's pretty good, but it's missing a trick in the sense that we are left with the likelihood of exoneration conclusions in cases which, in my view, are morally problematic, right? And so as you say, actually, the fact that I retrospectively endorse and that I'm very proud of the security conscious self I have become, to me, that doesn't mean that it's not morally problematic. And then my question is, okay, but then what is it that we need as an extra tool in our philosophical toolbox to capture what's gone wrong, right? And my attempt was to formulate that in relation to inner mobility, saying, well, perhaps one of the things that's gone wrong is that my inner mobility has been compromised. That because of what I find really interesting is that the social media influence is so exhaustive in the sense that it covers not just your online life, but your offline life. Like all my friends have been recommended, let's say by Facebook. I have joined societies recommended by Facebook. I only see news of a certain kind, etc., etc. And so the self that could otherwise anchor the reflective endorsement test in the way Chrisman has formulated it. And remember, Chrisman formulated this way before social media platforms became so powerful, actually. But so there is not enough of the self left to anchor the reflective endorsement test, I would say. So that's what I find fascinating with social media influence, is that you could argue it is so exhaustive that it doesn't leave enough of the self left to anchor a reflective endorsement test. And then that's why I say, actually, we should be looking at inner mobility as something of value, and which, when it's lost, we have lost something super important. And that's not captured. Yeah, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah.
Thank you.
I was wondering if I could follow up on that, actually, Sylvie, because this was a bit of the talk that was slightly puzzling me too. I mean, I think one of the insights of somebody like Christman is that the question of what actually happens to you, what types of influences you have, their valency for whether you're being authentic or not is to some extent dependent upon your attitudes, or the attitude you would have under certain conditions. And it feels as though you want to hold on to that thought, because that feels like it's an important, recognizing the value of that feels like an important thing in recognizing the sort of value of human agency, or sort of the way that we construct our lives well. But in that case, it seems to me that this inner mobility that you describe, I don't know why that can't just be made sort of our attitude towards that isn't just sensitive to what people feel about it as well. That is, suppose that you take your person who has been made more security conscious by this social media influence, and you just run a test like Christman's with them. You say, look, you've gone through this kind of causal process and it's had the following effects. It's made you feel like this. It's made you take these things to be salient, but not these things. And the cost of that is that you have become a less mutable personality. There are fewer alternative people that you might become in future. In light of that, what's your attitude towards it? Well, Christman would say, look, if in light of that cost, this person now wishes that process hadn't gone through that process, then it is indeed genuinely an authenticity undermining process. But if in light of that cost, they think, well, okay, I'm kind of happy to trade off a bit of inner mobility for the sort of fixity that involves actually having a determinate personality, well, then who are we to gainsay them?
Yeah, but you see, I don't know if you can do that, because once you've lost, if we've gone through a process where arguably your inner mobility is compromised in the way we have describes it, you are actually alienated enough to arguably not be able to answer the reflective endorsement test in a way that counts as valid in a way that is not captured by either authenticity or competency. So that's basically what the question would be, right? It's that in the recipe or the kind of things to watch out for, competency and authenticity are very important. But what if it's not enough, in the sense that once you are truly alienated, in the sense that you've lost this inner mobility, then arguably your answers, even if you say, yeah, I'm very happy to be fixed in that way, it's too late, that you're already stuck. And so your answer is arguably less than valid. I don't like the word valid. It's problematic just in virtue of the fact that you're stuck.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that there are slightly unpalatable connotations to the word valid, but I think that's because there are slightly unpalatable connotations for the line of thought. I mean, sure, if we think your consent to these things is not valid if you've been alienated, and we define alienation in terms of losing that particular psychological quality, and we think that's bad and also consent undermining, irrespective of your attitude towards that property, then I sort of see that it works formally. But I suppose I wonder why we should lionize inner mobility rather than, for example, piety or cheerfulness or desire or something of that sort. In all of those cases, I guess we would think it would be sort of inappropriate to take one particular type of psychological state somebody might be in and claim that they're not valuing it as a sign that they're incapable of giving consent to the changes that lead to it. And I'm just wondering what's different about inner mobility for you.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? And I suppose the answer would have to be something like, I'm gonna, okay, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about this discussion of the soul in Plato. But I mean, this is completely, but basically that, could it be that there's something inherently human about this ability to always transform ourselves, in the sense that you could argue, if I was to try and frame this in terms of dignity, there is something of inherent, or how you call it, something essential is lost when you lose inner mobility, in a way that's different if, say, you were to lose piety or you were to lose playfulness, all things that are arguably very important for various people from different perspectives. But inner mobility would be of a qualitatively different nature because of this argument that would be framed in terms of what makes it uniquely human. Now, that can also be a slippery slope, I realize. Yeah, I'm really thinking on, because this is to me something that I haven't quite, I'm really interested in this notion of inner mobility, particularly to capture what might go wrong in terms of especially social media influence. But there are two problems with it. One is, practically speaking, it's very hard to formulate a kind of, let's say if I were to speak to regulators, they would laugh at me if I say, oh, you should worry about inner mobility, because they're like, yes, Sylvie, okay, but how are we going to test that someone's lost their inner mobility? That's certainly going to be highly problematic. And so that's one problem. And the other problem, as you say, then you could try and challenge why inner mobility should have this special status over other, call them psychological states if you want. And that is where intuitively I think there is a difference, but it probably requires a much longer answer to try and back this up. And I would be very interested, actually, if there's anybody here in the discussion who's read anything that could add to this discussion, because I'm keen to try and develop this further. This is where it's really work in progress, and I would value input.
Well, sorry, I'm aware I've got a question from Ding coming up, but I'll say one more thing on this, Sylvie, because it might be relevant here, which is I think Christman's way of dealing with this is a very interesting one, but for what it's worth, I've tried to put down myself ways of thinking about these questions, which I find more persuasive than Crispin's way of doing it. I mean, in particular, I suppose, trying to articulate I sympathize with you that there's something sort of very centrally human about some kind of capacity to set the rules and standards for what counts as valuable for yourself. I think that's at the core of how I understand individual autonomy, maybe not as a type of agency, but as a kind of whole life ideal. But I think the crucial thing is that that recognition goes awry if we think that what you have to preserve is some kind of capacity for people to be endlessly changeable and mutable. I mean, somebody having a mutable identity or person might well be a sign that they're able to live up to this ideal, but somebody having a very fixed and static person doesn't mean that they don't, in just the same way that freedom looks like it has a kind of contingent relation to the external manifestations of that kind of autonomy. So perhaps this is something for us to pick up afterwards, if you'd like to talk about it a bit further. I think there's stuff that you might find useful in that domain. Anyway, I will stop abusing the chair right now and invite Ding to give his question.
Hi, I just have a point. I think probably you have two distinct kind of worry here. One is manipulation, and the other is rigidification. So my view on this is that there are two distinct types of harm on autonomy. So both of them can harm autonomy, but they are different. So rigidification, the loss of inner mobility, is not a form of manipulation. So I give you a case, a personal experience on this. So I was from China, and in our high school is famous for like high pressure, like exam oriented. So in my high school education, I was asked to recite a lot of stuff without giving any explanation on like the mechanism or the interesting intellectual stuff behind those knowledge. So I thought like my creativity and critical thinking was kind of harmed in that sense, and I kind of lost my inner mobility to shape my idea, to shape my views or positions. So I think I'm under the threat of rigidification, but I won't say my high school manipulated me in that case. My autonomy is definitely harmed, but it's not harmed by manipulation. So the difference is that I think there's a less sense of something purposeful in that scenario. So when we talk about manipulation, we have the image of like a puppet, string and puppet kind of image in that. So it's like the manipulator is very purposeful and have a strong, clear intention to shape your behavior towards some direction. But rigidification can happen in a very automatic or like less purposeful way. So I think this is kind of two different things. Yes, yeah.
There are different things. I have no question about that. And I wouldn't use rigidification is a completely, again, much wider set of concerns than the specific thing about inner mobility. So I think there are many things in our environment or people around us that can rigidify both our ways of thinking or ways of behaving, and we're constantly under pressure. The question is really, it's a potential for transformation, and so it's not about. So you might be a very stable person, but if you have retained the potential for transformation, then in Rehel Yegi's world and something that I'm trying to formulate, you're probably okay. And so it's to try and distinguish between what might be a fairly rigid way of living and under constraints that might include education, for instance, distinguish that from a potential for transformation, which is compromising the very, as I argue, different types of conditions than just conditions that rigidify either your way of thinking or your way of behaving. And that the compromising of the potential for transformation can be the result of manipulation. It need not be, right? But manipulation can be a source or can be the cause of this compromission. And so that's what I find super interesting in the context of augmented reality and virtual reality, is that this is, I mean, when we when we were doing these experiments, I ended up being quite concerned actually about the potential for what I call formatting. Now here, you could argue that's more a type of rigidification like you were talking about, with the school effectively formatting students into certain ways of thinking. Except that if you go very far, you could then question, once you've gone beyond cognitive rigidification, where you've actually undermined the forces that you can rely on to change yourself, then, you know, that's where I would argue we're in hot waters. And I really worry about, given the potent pre-reflective effect of augmented and virtual reality, I worry that that's the kind of stuff that can be influenced way beyond the normal rigidification through education, etc. Anyway, that's again a long answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Neil, a question.
Thanks. I think it's a really key concept, this inner mobility. And I think that's something that we're going to see more as, sort of, in my experience, students go for using ChatGPT and the concept of laziness. One concept I've thought of in that comes from the idea of a lazy eye, where a kid has an eye that's not actually quite working. And part of the solution of that is the good working eye has to be covered to make them put effort into the other one. So I think there is something that could be lost, for example, in seeing augmented reality as a way of virtually gaslighting, for example, and how it might shift power structures to decide what I think, and maybe even a sort of metaphor of an abusive relationship where that inner mobility has been compromised and crushed, and the woman may well have been somebody who, you know, had that, whatever this is, strength of character, will, reflexivity, and yet the external pressures which could be coming from powerful states or corporations use AR for, then compromises that, and they become, in a sense, lazy, I suppose. But I think it's a really important concept that is going to become important as we face ChatGPT as well as augmented reality issues.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I suppose I can only say I agree. But the ChatGPT thing, that's a whole other ball game. I mean, I am incredibly worried about all sorts of aspects of, but I don't think we should mix everything together. Though it is very much the case, having dipped my toes into that field years ago, I think augmented reality is going to be linked with large language models. This is the way forward. And as a training tool, whether it's for professionals like GPs or others, you know, it's one thing to train, say, plane pilots, but another to train doctors, educators, lawyers with these tools. I'm very genuinely concerned about what could be completely missed as a harm that is not apprehended. If you adopt a consequentialist kind of outlook, you're completely gonna miss it. And if you adopt a very focus on cognitive autonomy, you're also gonna miss it. And this, what I would argue, is that's the problem with also manipulations. The whole discourse on manipulation is so focused on cognitive autonomy that it's missed the extent to which on non-cognitive, what I call pre-reflective intelligence, can be compromised by interventions, whether they range from nudges to the kind of potent tools we're going to see emerge in the next few years, which combine augmented reality and large language models in a way that are going to trick us. I mean, you know, I find it completely fascinating. I mean, I've been in the cave. The cave is one of these very early instances of virtual reality. It's fascinating. There's one in UCL where you can go and try if you ever go to UCL. And it's very low tech, but it's fascinating because precisely, you know, it's not real. The scenario you're experiencing is not real. But part of you, this primitive part of the brain really doesn't get that. And so you start sweating, you start having heartbeat that goes up, etc., in a way that does not happen when you do that through role play. And I find that raises significant questions. And then when you combine that with the manipulative potential of large language models, I mean, we are in a situation that, yeah.
Well, I think before we get into ChatGPT, I might suggest that we stop for another break. So I think it remains to thank Sylvie again for an extremely thought-provoking presentation.